9 ships do not all lose confidence at once. They turn because somebody has changed the cost of moving forward. That was the real scene in the Strait of Hormuz. Not a map, not a think tank chart, a live waterway tanker slowing down, helms changing angle, radar tracks bending away from the narrowest corridor on the planet, crews waiting, traders watching Washington rushing to point at the image and say the same thing empires always say when they need a picture to do political work for them. Look, pressure is working. But the real story was not that some ships turned. The real story was that after airstrikes, after threats, after sanctions, after the full theater of American force, Iran still had not surrendered the one card that matters most in this war. And the reason it had not surrendered that card was not courage alone, not rhetoric, not ideology, not the usual television language about resistance. The reason was that by the time the crisis reached Hormuz, China had already spent roughly 10 years building the structure that would keep Iran from collapsing under exactly this kind of pressure. That is the only axis that matters here. The real story is not that the strait became dangerous. The real story is that China spent a decade making sure Iran would not have to give Hormuz up on American terms. If you miss that, you miss everything, because then you keep asking the wrong question. You keep asking whether America can hurt Iran. Of course it can. America can hurt almost anyone. It can bomb infrastructure, tighten sanctions, flood a theater with warships, frighten insurers, spike oil, squeeze markets, and make an economy bleed. That was never the hard question. The hard question was whether visible superiority could be converted into the specific political outcome Washington wanted. Could America force Iran to hand over the one piece of geography that makes Iran strategically relevant while China stood behind Tehran with enough economic architecture to prevent pain from becoming surrender? That is the Hormuz question. And once you ask it that way, the whole picture changes. Start with geography, because geography is where all the lies go to die. The Strait of Hormuz is not an abstraction. It is a narrow corridor, roughly 21 miles at its tightest point, carrying around 1/5 of the world's oil supply. Qatari gas, Saudi crude, Iraqi barrels, Kuwaiti exports, Emirati energy, insurance risk, tanker schedules, fiscal planning, food prices, market psychology, electoral pressure. It is one of those places where a few miles of water can govern the mood of half the planet. Now put Iran on the northern edge of that corridor. No sanctions package changes that. No speech changes that. No carrier strike group changes that. Air power can punish Iran. It cannot relocate Iran. This was always Tehran S1 irreplaceable card. And the more Washington climbed the escalation ladder, the more valuable that card became. That is the first thing the standard commentary keeps refusing to understand. It still treats Hormuz as a problem to be managed inside an American pressure campaign. In reality, Hormuz is the point where the pressure campaign runs into geography and discovers geography has voting rights. That alone would already make this a hard problem for Washington. But the real difficulty did not come from geography alone. It came from preparation. And this is where China enters the story in the only way that really matters, not as a loud military ally, not as a country firing missiles on Iran's behalf, not as some cartoon villain in a cable. News narrative China mattered because it spent years building background systems that would let Iran stay alive politically and economically when this exact kind of confrontation arrived. Call it survival infrastructure. That is the framework word that explains the whole board. Survival infrastructure is what a state has before the crisis starts, that allows it to absorb punishment after the crisis begins. It is not heroic language. It is plumbing, payment channels, shipping methods, reserve cushions, diplomatic blocking positions, parallel routes, quiet institutions that do not look dramatic until the day they become the difference between pain and collapse. China spent a decade helping Iran build precisely that difference. Look at the layers. First came the financial layer, the 2021-25 year partnership did not appear out of nowhere. It was the visible signature on a longer strategic decision. Beijing had already identified Iran as one of the key pieces between East Asia and Europe, one of the critical points in any long contest over trade, energy, sanctions, resistance, and access. That is why the relationship kept deepening, oil agreements, technology transfers, financial channels that could function outside the dollar system. None of that was random diplomacy. It was structure, and structure matters because sanctions only work cleanly when the target has nowhere else to breathe. Hadn't it helped make sure Iran would have somewhere else to breathe? Then came the payment logic. If a sanctioned state can be pushed entirely through dollar choke points, Washington holds a knife against its throat. If trade begins moving through alternative currency channels, the knife still cuts, but not as deeply and not as fast. That is the whole strategic importance of yuan-denominated energy and parallel financial rails. Not that they replace the global dollar order overnight. They do not. Their importance is narrower and more dangerous. They give a pressured state extra time, and in coercive strategy, time is oxygen. Then came the shipping layer. The shadow fleet was not built in a week. Ships going dark, cargoes relabeled, transfers blurred, ownership chains made harder to punish cleanly. This was not improvisation born yesterday morning. It was the product of years of learning how to move under sanctions without advertising the route. By the time this war intensified, the ecosystem for keeping Iranian-linked energy alive in altered form already existed. That matters, because a war does not begin on an empty board. It begins on the board each side prepared in advance. Then came stored endurance. Strategic reserves do not sound cinematic until the missiles start flying. Then they become political time. A state that enters an energy crisis with deep reserves is not calm because it feels morally superior. It is calm because it knows the panic clock will hit somebody else first. China's stockpiling mattered because Washington's pressure logic depended in part on market pain translating into political compression. But if the largest outside partner, most central to Iran's endurance arrives prepared for the shock, the pressure wave lands on a different timetable, and then came diplomatic architecture. China did not need to declare war on America to change this board. It only needed to make sure Washington could not build a clean, universal, morally simple coalition for total Iranian submission. The here or refusal there, language in this escalation, support for de-escalation without surrender. Enough ambiguity to keep the diplomatic field muddy and the war from becoming a neat one-way legitimacy story for Washington. Put those pieces together, and one fact becomes unavoidable. Iran did not need comfort. Iran needed resilience. It needed enough revenue, enough trade, enough political cover, enough logistical flexibility, enough external oxygen that American force would generate punishment without generating automatic capitulation. That is what China helped create. Not victory, not rescue, resilience. And resilience is what makes this crisis much harder for Washington than Washington expected. Because once Tehran can survive, the decision tree changes. Look first at Iran's tree. Iran has three broad paths. The first path is surrender the Hormuz card, except that after all the bombing and all the sanctions, the one mechanism that turns Iranian geography into strategic relevance must now be neutralized on Washington's terms. That path might reduce pressure in the short run, but structurally it is the worst option Tehran has. It would teach every rival and every future negotiator that Iran's only indispensable card can be beaten out of its hand. The second path is total escalation, turn Hormuz into an uncontrollable battlefield, shut everything, strike blindly, force every Gulf state and every fence sitter to conclude that Iran is not bargaining with geography but burning it down. That path sounds powerful on television and usually ends by making the target more isolated than before. The third path is the only serious Iranian path: open selectively, restrict selectively, tie access to conditions, turn passage into leverage, turn shipping into negotiation, refuse unconditional surrender without triggering the kind of reckless regional blowback that would collapse your own position. That is why Iran keeps trying to turn Hormuz into a bargaining instrument rather than a one-time explosion, because once you understand the board, you understand that Tehran is not trying to destroy the card. It is trying to prove the card cannot be taken away. And without the Chinese-built survival infrastructure behind it, that strategy would be far harder to sustain. Now look at Washington's tree. America also has three ugly options. The first is escalate harder, prove that overwhelming force still dominates the corridor, that naval power plus sanctions plus fear can eventually turn strategic resistance into submission. The problem is that the higher America climbs, the higher the collateral costs climb with it. Markets do not sit still. Allies do not stay equally committed. Insurers do not remain brave forever. And every extra layer of force raises the risk that a campaign meant to discipline Iran turns into a larger test of American endurance in front of the entire world. The second is accept a negotiated partial outcome and still market it as success. That means admitting, whether openly or not, that Hormuz did not simply reopen because Washington commanded it to reopen. It means living with the fact that Iran retained agency. It means accepting that bargaining, not pure coercion, determined the movement of ships. The third is keep pressure high and hope time does the work. That is probably the most tempting option in Washington because it postpones the moment of strategic honesty. But it is also the option Chinese planning was designed to complicate most directly. Because if the whole purpose of survival infrastructure is to stretch the target ES endurance, then time becomes less useful to the coercer than he assumed. Then there is China's tree. China can directly challenge the United States militarily in a theater where Washington is already concentrated. and where Beijing has very little interest in a head-on naval collision. That is the worst Chinese option. China can abandon Iran and demonstrate to every current and future partner that Chinese backing is real only until risk begins. That is almost as bad, or China can keep doing exactly what it has been doing. Stay below direct war, keep the economic oxygen flowing, keep the diplomatic field complicated, keep alternative channels alive, keep learning from the crisis, keep proving that American pressure no longer operates in an empty arena against isolated targets. That third path is not dramatic, it is not made for applause. It does not give you a cinematic flag-raising moment, but it is exactly the kind of third-player strategy that alters systems over time, and that is why the monetary angle matters so much. The question is not whether the dollar vanished, it did not. The question is whether Washington can still assume that its sanctions and pressure toolkit automatically closes every gain the wait once imagined. If energy payments, shipping networks, reserve cushions, and political cover can now be split across alternative systems, then pressure still hurts. But it hurts differently. It stops being an automatic endgame machine. That is the lesson being studied far beyond Tehran. Gulf monarchies are watching, BRIC states are watching, finance ministries in the global south are watching. Every sanctioned or sanctioned vulnerable state is watching. They are now only asking whether Iran survived. They are asking how Iran survived, which channels held, which system stayed open, which partner mattered, which types of pressure created pain without creating surrender. That is how one crisis becomes a template for 10 future calculations. There is a historical echo here. This is not Suez repeated line for line, but it rhymes with Suez in one crucial way. Britain and France still had force in 1956. They could still move troops. They could still generate the optics of military success. What they could not do was escape the larger structure tightening around them. Their weakness was not a shortage of force. Their weakness was a failure to understand the foundation underneath the operation. Hormuz exposes something similar for the United States. America has overwhelming military superiority over Iran. That is obvious. But superiority is not the same thing as strategic finality. The real question is whether military force alone can still compel the final political outcome Washington wants when the target has already been loaded into alternative payment systems, shipping methods, reserve capacity, and diplomatic cover cultivated by China over time. If the answer is no, then Hormuz is not just another Middle East flare-up. It is a public demonstration of the limits of modern coercion against a state that arrived pre-insured against the exact pressure being used. And now we'll go back to the opening image. Tensions turned around. Washington wanted the image to mean that the campaign was working, but the deeper meaning of the image was harsher than that. After all the strikes, all the threats, all the warnings, all the sanctions, the argument still ran through the same waterway, the same Iranian shore, and the same decade of Chinese preparation that kept Tehran from having to hand over its one indispensable card. So the right closing judgment is not that Iran defeated America. That is too sloppy. The right judgment is more exact. America discovered that visible power can arrive at the scene and still hit an invisible wall if somebody spent 10 years building that wall first. It discovered that military dominance is not identical to strategic closure. It discovered that sanctions are not omnipotent once alternative systems mature enough to keep a target breathing. And it discovered all of this in the most important energy corridor on Earth, where geography keeps humiliating the idea that force alone can vote last. So when people ask why Iran would never give up Hormuz, the answer is not emotion. The answer is structure. Hormuz is how Iran converts geography into relevance. China spent 10 years making sure that if Tehran ever had to defend that relevance under maximum pressure, it would not be doing so while suffocating in total isolation. That is the real story. Not that some ships turned, not that one side looked stronger on television for an afternoon. The real story is that the board had been prepared in the dark for years, and the world only really saw it when the waterway lit up. And that leads to the only question that matters after Hormuz. If China spent a decade making sure Iran would not have to surrender this card on American terms, what other cards has it already spent the last decade preparing to protect somewhere else? That is the question Washington should be afraid to answer, because the lesson of Hormuz is not that force disappeared. The lesson is that force showed up late to a board that had already been arranged